All right, everyone. I think that we'll get started. Try to start on time so that we leave plenty of time for questions at the end of this. My name is Kevin Bone. I am with the Wright-Ingraham Institute. I am also the director of the Field Stations program for the Wright-Ingraham Institute. It is our position that small-scale, experimental, creative educational programming has a critical role to play in our efforts to teach towards sustainability. The Wright-Ingraham Institute's model for this educational work practices under the banner of field stations. The evolving program is an immersive, place-based, field-rooted study of natural and human systems, studies that are realized within a wide space of many disciplines. It is our experience that this process enhances the way we see the world. This focused experience of the landscape and its inhabitants, assisted by the proper guides, helps us to better understand the complex interconnectedness of all things. Working together on what is meaningful to us can only help us make a more positive impact. I ask you this year to consider giving to the Wright-Ingraham Institute and the work that we do. I invite you to participate in our institute in other ways, contribute to our photo galleries, apply to our 2022 grants call, consider donating directly to the Wright-Ingraham Institute to help support programming like this. And if you're of a suitable age and suitable qualifications, apply for our summer field stations program in the San Juan River watershed. We will be opening the call for applications up in mid-December, and the call will remain open until mid-February. The program dates are June 1 through 29, 2022. And I think there will be some links up in the chat window for that all. So with that short introduction, we welcome you all to the fourth and final session of our 2021 speaker series on design, ecology, and justice. I will now hand the programming over to our colleague, Ariel Milkman. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kevin. Hi, everyone. My name is Ariel Milkman. I'm a social scientist and writer collaborating with the Field Stations program. I'm from Denver, Colorado, the traditional homelands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. And I'm speaking with you today from my new residence in Portland, Oregon, which lies on the village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other native nations of the Columbia River area. I would like to invite you to join me in meaningful action and reflection about the purpose of land acknowledgements. And as such, I'm extending a call to contribute as you can to Indigenous-led organizations in the Southwest. Land in the Southwest is the topic of tonight's event. After this introduction, I'm going to put a link in the chat to the Navajo and Hopi families COVID-19 Relief Fund. I'm so pleased to be welcoming these speakers to talk about their work on how we can understand the impacts of extraction, and in doing so, plan for a more equitable future. During this event, we will first hear from each speaker about their work, and then we're going to have a moderated discussion led by Dr. Becky Claussen, who's joining us from Fort Lewis College. We ask that if you have a question, you please share it in the chat, and time permitting, we're going to pose the questions to the speakers. So let's get started. I'm now honored to introduce our first speaker, Jonathan Thompson. Jonathan was born and raised in southwestern Colorado. He owned and edited the Silverton Standard and the minor newspaper in the tiny town of Silverton, and he was the editor-in-chief of High Country News from 2007 to 2010. He now runs the landdesk.org, which is a public lands newsletter. In 2016, Jonathan was awarded the Society of Environmental Journalists Outstanding Beat Reporting Small Market. Jonathan is the author of the following books: River of Lost Souls, Behind the Slick Rock Curtain, and Sagebrush Empire. Welcome, Jonathan. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. I'm going to get started here really quickly with a little bit of an overview of the background of extraction on the Animas River watershed and in the Animas River watershed. And the reason I'm talking about the Animas River watershed in this case is because it is a river that flows down into runs into the San Juan River in Farmington, New Mexico. It starts in the San Juans and it goes through the San Juan River, then goes through the Four Corners area and the Navajo Nation. And the Animas River is also the site of the Gold King spill. So I'll touch on that here a little bit more. So here I'm going to try to share my screen and hopefully this will work. Okay, let's see here. Hold on a minute. Okay, maybe that's not going to work, actually. Hold on, maybe I can do something else here.
Is the system giving you, oh, there we go.
Is it working? You can see
Yeah, we
it?
can see your screen now. Yeah.
Great. Okay, here we go then. Brief history of extraction in the Animas River watershed. This is an overview of the watershed and what it looks like. If you look up on the right-hand side, you'll see the Gold King mine right above Silverton, Colorado. And you'll see the Animas River is that orange line or orange faded tinted line that goes down, joins the San Juan River in Farmington, which runs up right through the Four Corners area and into Utah, and eventually goes on to join the Colorado River in what is now Lake Powell. This is the Silverton Caldera, and this is near the headwaters of the Animas River. This is an ancient magma chamber that collapsed about 27 million years ago. And that geological phenomena is what made it a mineral-rich place that later attracted miners. But before that, it was and it still is the homeland of the Ute people, the Navajo or Diné, and the Pueblo people. It contains sacred mountains and as well as the headwaters of a number of rivers besides the Animas, including the San Juan, the Uncompahgre, San Miguel, the Dolores, and so forth. European Americans first started coming in here in about the 1860s to get at the minerals that were in this collapsed volcano. And then mining really kicked up in earnest in the early 1870s. And this picture is some miners, and it's kind of your stereotypical, what you think of when you think of miners, these Western rugged individualist kind of guys out there making it on their own. It's kind of an incomplete picture of what mining really was like. First of all, they weren't really individualists because they were basically here to get free land from the government. It was land that had been stolen from the indigenous peoples, and then basically the government handed it out under the General Mining Law of 1872 to anybody who wanted it, basically, who could say that they were going to mine it, they could have it. And there was other forms of this in the Homestead Act and the Railroad Act, basically big land giveaways all over the place. So most of these people, rather than being kind of individualists and making it on their own, they were kind of on the government dole. And what they did is they staked mining claims. And in the beginning, they did kind of work them on their own, and they were small scale affairs. But in the early 1880s, the railroad made its way into the San Juan Mountains, and that changed everything because it allowed them to bring in heavy equipment and basically industrialize the whole affair. So you went from that to something like this, where you had, this is a place called Silver Lake, a huge mining operation. And here you can start to see, you can just see some of the impacts that extraction had. It's basically an industrialization of the landscape. This was a pristine mountain alpine lake at one point. Obviously, it no longer is at this point. You've got all this stuff everywhere. You've got the mountains are miles and miles of tunnels into these mountains. And then I want to talk about one form of water pollution right now. If you look in the foreground at the bottom of the picture, you see a bunch of white. It looks kind of like snow or maybe like sand, like a beach. That is actually tailings, mill tailings. And what mill tailings are is the huge, huge waste stream from mining. What happens is you take the ore out of the mountainside, and then you pulverize it into a fine dust. And then you use gravity or chemical means to separate the metals out of the ore. But ore is, it's basically 98% just waste rock, and the rest, only about 2% is the metals. So if you have a ton of ore, you've got a couple pounds of metals, and the rest is tailings. And that for years and years, for decades, actually, they just dumped it into the nearest, usually the nearest water body around. In this case, it was Silver Lake. They dumped it in there and they filled it in, a big part of it in the process, killing pretty much everything that was in the lake, because the tailings have a lot of heavy metals in them, plus that it's a very fine silt. They also dumped it into rivers. And so in the Animas River's case, that silt, toxic silt, basically ran down the river for miles through Durango, all the way down to Farmington, all the way down onto Navajo Nation. And it did it every single day. So it was a severe problem for years and years, and downstream users complained. They did lawsuits. Quite often the courts ruled in favor of the downstream people, but they never forced the miners to clean up their act or to shut down until the 1930s. So you had at least 50 years where this was just wholesale dumping of pollution into the rivers. That problem was eventually subsided, but there's another problem with mining that does not subside. Here's just another picture of what mining really came to look like when it was the big industrial part. So now I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about the Gold King mine, to talk about one of the other sort of more insidious problems with mining, hard rock mining. So this is Bonita Peak, and this is above Silverton, Colorado, right in the heart of that Silverton Caldera. And you can look at this and you can see that there's these kind of lighter patches. Those are mined rock waste dumps, and that's the waste rock that comes out of the mine itself. It's not tailings, but it's waste rock that they just dump on the side. It doesn't have that much minerals in it, so they dump it out and then they take the ore out. If you look over on the kind of center right, you'll see a little building there. It's actually a pretty big building. That's the boarding house for the Gold King mine, and that was the entrance to one of the levels of the Gold King mine. Later, it would be moved down further down to the left, and that's where it blew out in 2015. But this was an earlier one, and what they had is several levels, and it was quite extensive workings inside that mountain. And this is just the Gold King mill during pretty much the height of its existence. It became probably the biggest gold producer in the region for a long time. And this just shows how big of an operation it was. It actually had kind of its own town, Gladstone, around it. Now, pretty much nothing's left at this place. Here's the Gold King mine boarding house. Again, you can kind of see the impacts of extraction right here, all this junk everywhere, this big, huge pile of waste rock. And one thing I want to bring your attention to is kind of right in the middle, there's this white stream coming down out of what looks like a little house. That's water. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go to the next shot. Here, we've got a diagram showing how acid mine drainage forms. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you see that we've got precipitation falls on these mountains. These mountains are highly fractured because it was a caldera. So there's lots of cracks and faults and various ways for the water to seep into the earth and flow through the earth. And eventually it seeps back out in the form of a spring. Because this environment is pretty much anaerobic, yeah, it's not that big of a deal. Most of the water that comes out is pretty clean, even though it's running through this highly mineralized stuff. It's got minerals in it when it comes out, but it's fairly clean. But if you look down on the lower right-hand diagram, you'll see what happens when mining is introduced. Basically, first of all, the hydrology is hijacked. So you build these tunnels into the mountain, and they draw the water that's seeping very slowly into these tunnels or shafts or adits or drifts, whatever you want to call them. And they, so you end up with basically like a stream inside these tunnels. And meanwhile, you're also, by digging holes into the mountains and turning the inside of the mountains into Swiss cheese, you're basically, you're introducing oxygen into the process as well. And these mountains are made up mostly of sulfites. It's iron sulfite or iron pyrite. And what happens when you get the water, the H2O and the oxygen, the O2, and the iron sulfite, is you get a chemical reaction that creates sulfuric acid. And then that sulfuric acid, that water then is acidic, and that water then dissolves the metals that are in the rock already that they're mining for. Anything from zinc to cadmium, lead, copper, aluminum, silver, magnesium, sometimes mercury. Luckily, there's not a whole lot of mercury in the San Juans, but then that all mixes into this soup, which is, so you've got acidic water, all these metals, that runs out of the mine and into the creeks. And all those metals are toxic to fish and to other aquatic life. They're not so good for humans either. And those go into the streams and run downstream. I'll just show you this picture. This is just some cross sections of some of the mines up above Silverton and the Animas River watershed, just to show you how extensive these mines are. They're huge. The Sunnyside mine, for example, that you see down below, it's like 1,200 feet high. There's a 1,200 foot elevation spread in there with tunnels all through there. So it's quite extensive. So the Sunnyside mine, for example, when it was still open, it was draining 1,600 gallons per minute of acid mine drainage. This is another picture that just sort of shows the same thing, just to show how extensive these things are and to show how much acid mine drainage really you could create with these things. This is what acid mine drainage looks like when it comes out of the mine. This is the Gold King mine before it blew out. It's orange because it's got a lot of iron in it, but it's also got a lot of other nasty stuff in it. It was draining here. This is probably like 100 gallons per minute or something like that at this point. And this is the result of acid mine drainage. So this map, what this map is showing is zinc loading in the various streams. The red means that it's more than 1,500 parts of zinc per million, which is pretty heavy. Zinc is not good for fish. You'll notice that the blue is which is clean water, basically. You'll notice that a lot of these streams start out as blue up high, and then they run down, and as they pass mining sites, they become yellow and then red, and basically unable to sustain fish. This map was made in the 90s before a lot of the cleanup action had taken place. So the conditions actually improved in some places after cleanup occurred. Cleanup does work somewhat. It can help clean up the situation, but you never make it go away. One way they do try to make it go away, though, is that acid mine drainage is that they try to plug up these tunnels with bulkheads. And that seems to work. This is about the size of a boxcar, a big concrete plug. And it seems to work. It's like, great. If we can keep the water in the mountain, then we don't have to worry about it draining out and poisoning the fish, right? And it works for a while, except that not too long after they put this bulkhead in the early 2000s, the water backed up and it started coming out in other places, including the Gold King mine. And so So when it comes to acid mine drainage, really the only way to solve the problem of acid mine drainage is to treat the water, put it through a treatment plant. And that actually works really well. You can put it through a treatment plant, it comes out extremely pure, like drinking water pure, which is great as long as treatment plant's running. So the Gold King mine in the early 2000s started leaking water, started draining water because water had backed up from another mine. And they started treating it. They were treating the water. And what happened is that eventually the Gold King treatment plant shut down because the person who was running it was evicted. It's a long story and I won't get into it. But if you look at the graph on the lower right-hand side, you can see what happened. It was in 2005 that shut down. So they did a fish count in 2005, and you can see that trout density was up there in the, pretty high. But then by 2010, when they did another fish count, trout density had dropped significantly. And that's because there was a lot more metals running into the watershed, essentially. And this is quite a ways downstream from where the mines actually are. So this is a good example of A, what acid mine drainage can do to a stream, and B, how well water treatment can work if you do it. The problem with water treatment is that you have to do it in perpetuity. You can't stop, because if you do, this happens. And eventually something even worse can happen. This is the Gold King mine blowout. What happened here is that acid mine drainage was coming out of the mine. And then one day the ceiling collapsed and it started backing up water, 3 million gallons of it to be precise. And when the EPA was trying to check it out to try to figure out how to clean it up, it burst out. It all came out at once. And I think Carletta will talk a little bit more about that, but it was a catastrophic event. They closed the river down in Durango. This is what the river looked like down by Durango. This is down on the right hand is what it's supposed to look like. And the river looked like that for miles and miles downstream. So now I'm going to back up and that's kind of the upper watershed stuff. Now I'm going to go to the lower watershed really quickly. This is Durango. And you can see that there's smoke in the background. That smoke is from a smelter. This is the smelter. This is where they smelted the ores from Silverton. So they took them out of the mine, took them on the railroad, took them here, and then they cooked the metals, basically cooked the metals out of the other material. And it's, as you can see, there's a lot of coal is burned for that. So you get a lot of coal pollution. It's unmitigated. There's no scrubbers or anything on these smokestacks. Plus, there's a lot of other toxic stuff going on. There's usually mercury is used to amalgamate the gold, pull the gold out of away from other materials. You get the metals are actually cooked, so you get a lot of nasty stuff besides the coal smoke coming out of the chimneys. And this was, this happened for a long time right near Durango, which is now kind of, a desirable place to live and all that, but it was actually a highly polluted place. But this is also on the banks of the Animas River. Here's the same site again in the 1940s after it had been converted to a uranium mill. So you can see that the river literally wraps right around that. And this, in the 1940s during World War II, it was converted into a uranium mill to process uranium from Western Colorado and Utah. And it was used, they produced yellow cake, which was used in the Manhattan Project and possibly in the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Here's another picture of that same thing from a different angle. And you can see there on the left, this was probably the 60s, right at when the uranium mill was about to shut down, but you can see how gigantic that pile of uranium tailings is in the back. So that, again, that's this fine, dusty kind of substance. It's got a lot of radium in it. It's got radon, it's radioactive, plus a lot of other heavy metals, just like other tailings. And they also had liquid waste from this mill, a lot of which went directly into the Animas River. And a study even in the 50s found that downstream users were drinking, a lot of whom drank untreated river water, were actually drinking radioactive water. And they were watering their crops with it, they were feeding their livestock with it. So it was a serious impact to downstream users for many years as well. And then also at about the same time that shut down in the early 60s, oil and gas industry was ramping up earnestly. It started in the 1920s, but in the 1950s, a huge pipeline was built to California from Farmington. And so along the Animas River watershed on the lower part, you had oil and gas development ramping up. And this also can affect the river because one of the things that happens in oil and gas development is that they pull out huge amounts of water with the oil and gas. It's called produced water. And they either pump that back into the ground, or sometimes they dump it wherever it can spill, get into the water, and cause problems for water quality again. So it's just another one of the impacts that has been felt on the Animas River watershed. And finally, I just want to show you these graphs here. These are Animas River stream flows over time, starting in the late 1890s and ending a couple of years ago. And you can see the trend line is trending downward. Basically, there's less and less water in the river each year, thanks most likely to climate change effects. And because there's less water, there's less dilution. So the minerals and the metals and the compounds that are coming down from the mining area and from whatever other sources of pollution are less diluted, so they're more concentrated, so they're more harmful. And that's it for my quick overview of the history.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was great. Catherine just had the good idea to put some of Jonathan's book titles in the chat. So I want to do that momentarily. Or Jonathan, if you have the chance to give us some of the links to your work in the chat, that would be amazing.
Sure.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carletta Chief. Dr. Chief is an associate professor and extension specialist in the Department of Environmental Science at the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona. As an extension specialist, she works to bring relevant science to Native American communities in a culturally sensitive manner by providing hydrology expertise, transferring knowledge, assessing information needs, and developing applied science projects. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Chief.
Thank you, Ariel, and thank you to the Wright-Ingraham Institute for having me here today. And it's an honor to be on this panel with my colleagues, Jonathan Thompson and Amber Benali and Becky Claussen. Today, I would like to share with the audience here a really amazing project that I had the honor to be part of in partnership with the Navajo Nation and in partnership with various universities and tribal colleges to address the impact of the Gold Cane mine spill on the Navajo Nation. Specifically, how these partnerships were community-driven to assess exposures and risk perceptions following the Gold Cane mine spill. First, I want to introduce the concept of decolonizing framework. And decolonization, that is research methods that was framed by Linda Smith in her book, Decolonizing Methodology. Decolonization does not mean and has not meant a total rejection of all theory or research or Western knowledge. Rather, it's about centering Indigenous concerns and worldviews, and then coming to know and understand theory and research from Indigenous perspectives for Indigenous purposes. And then secondly, want to define indigenization. So indigenization means that we include Indigenous perspectives, values, and cultural understandings in the research, education, outreach, to position Indigenous ways of knowing at the center, which then informs the work that we do. And then to include cultural protocols and practices in the operations. Decolonization and indigenization was the center of the work that we did following the Gold Key mine spill. We ensured that tribal involvement occurred at every single step of the work that we did, even prior to working on the Gold Key mine spill. The University of Arizona was working with the Navajo Nation on various projects. So that supported the partnership building prior to the Gold Key mine spill occurring. And the invitation was, the work started with an invitation to conduct research, involve tribal consultation. The community identified the problem and formulated the research questions. We then were required to pursue the tribal approval process, and the community was involved in the proposal writing. There was training and capacity building that occurred, data collection in which the Navajo Nation was involved and our partners, and the dissemination was done in partnership with the Navajo Nation. And the data has been returned back to the Navajo Nation, where they have access to it. And then the partnership building continues on. So this graphic is just emphasizes how important it is to the partnership building, that it is ongoing and that it occurs prior to any kind of research being done. One of the unique aspects of the University of Arizona is that we have an Indian cooperative extension, where we have University of Arizona Indian extension agents that are based on tribal lands. We have several on the Navajo Nation, and specifically one agent in Shiprock, New Mexico, which is where the community that is one of the central communities being impacted by the spill. So through our extension agent and our partners, we were able to understand what the concerns were. Jeannie Benali, who's an extension agent, attended the community meetings, and we worked with her to identify those concerns. And here are some quotes from some of those concerns that we heard. That the San Juan River is very important to the Navajo people who live along this region. Oftentimes, many of our Navajo elders say, which is water is life. Water is the lifeline of the people, which was succinctly stated by the Navajo Nation president at the time, Russell Begay. We held listening sessions to understand what the concerns were by the people in 3 communities. And I want to share one of the quotes from one of the members who attended, who stated, "We don't want to lose the corn. What will be the generational effects to my great grandkids?" And that was at the Animas chapter listening session. We also held teach-ins in response. One of the statements held at the Shiprock teach-in was that Navajo citizen said, "I need to know people are taking action to do something together for the water because we need to." We also partnered with Chiliyazi, who's a Navajo farmer and also was the president of the Shiprock chapter at the time. He said the Gold Key mine spill is absolutely devastating to our agricultural families because many do not rely on farming for their livelihoods. In response to these concerns, we developed a fact sheet, and this fact sheet was made available to the Navajo citizens 2 weeks after the spill. So Jeannie Benali was instrumental in having this available at the community forums that she attended. So through the invitation by the Navajo Nation EPA, we formulated a team which included the Diné College, which is the oldest tribal college in the United States, which is a grassroots community organization, the Navajo Nation, including the EPA, the Water Resources Branch, Natural Resources Department, as well as the Community Health Representatives Program. Fort Lewis College, who is in the northern area of the Navajo Nation, Northern Arizona University, as well as the University of Arizona. Our team was also very interdisciplinary to address the three aspects of impacts to the spill, which really disrupted the balance and life of the people, which we call hojo. So we had expertise across these boundaries with all our partners. We also ensured that any faculty or student that was involved in our project was trained on how to work with tribal communities, both formally and informally trained, which includes ensuring that they took the Native American city research training for human research, as well as informal cultural protocol training that we received from our partners on the Navajo Nation. Our project goals was to understand the human exposure to the spill within a year, to find out what the levels of arsenic and lead are in environmental samples from the 3 chapters within 1 year, and then to survey what people think about the risk from the spill and report back measured risks. So the EPA perception of the risk assessment was based on recreation, and the recreation use of the spill, use of the river, and the risks from the spill. However, for the Diné people, the reality is that they use the river in many different ways beyond just recreation. The Diné people are very deeply connected to the river for not only spiritual practices, but also their livelihoods, subsistence practices, including farming, ranching, and hunting and gathering of medicinal plants and herbs, both for medicinal purposes as well as for cultural and medicinal purposes. Earlier, you saw a map shown by the first speaker where the spill is, but this map basically shows the path of the spill, but also the communities that we're working with: Upper Fruitland, Shiprock, and Anna. We did community presentations to ask the people what their concerns were, what areas were of most concern, what areas impacted the people the most, how would they like to be informed about the project, and just any feedback that they wanted to give. In the listening sessions that we held in the 3 communities, the people said that they do not trust research. They fear that the data won't come back. They are concerned about the long-term impacts to their community, including their children. They also stated that they wanted to approach this challenge, this problem, with their own worldview, with their own perspective. And this is a really profound statement that was made at one of the teach-ins, which the individual said, we need our own data to communicate to the world our own perspective on our own crisis and trauma. This is where we were guided by our Navajo mentors, Navajo elders, leaders, medicine people, to ensure that our work was applicable to the Diné fundamental laws. And we had elders that talked about the worldview, the epistemology of the Navajo people, how the Navajo people are deeply dependent on the land, not only for livelihoods, but also their culture, their worldviews, their beliefs, including the sacred mountains, the connection to Mother Earth, to Father Sky and how that connects to their everyday life, their seasons, their life stages. And so this just shows how deeply connected the Navajo people are to the natural worlds. So the Diné traditional laws are stated as that the elders and medicine people are the teachers of the traditional laws, values, and principles, and they must always be respected and honored if the people and the government are to persevere and thrive. Secondly, that the teachings of the elders and the medicine people, their participation in government, and their contributions of traditional values and principles of Diné lifeway will ensure the growth of the Navajo Nation. There's also the customary law, which says it is the right and freedom of the people that every child and every elder be respected and honored and protected with a healthy physical and mental environment free from all abuse. The Diné natural law is that the Diné have a sacred obligation and duty to respect, preserve, and protect all that was provided for, and that we were designated as the stewards of these relatives through our use of sacred gifts, language, and thinking. And these laws were abided by through consultation with our partners and mentors and medicine people. And one of the ways that we did this was not only in our research approach and working with the community and in our training, but also in dissemination of the results. Specifically in what the concerns of the people were, which were obtained through 12 focus groups that were held in the 3 communities. And the Diné health model was used as a guide to relay what the results were. So what you see here is the Diné health model, which is based on the Diné worldview and their deep connection to the land, which I showed to you earlier, as well as the various Diné laws that guide the people. So what we have here begins at the dawn, which is focused on spiritual wellness. And these are the categories focused on spiritual wellness listed here. And then economy and livelihood, which is the day, which are really, financial impacts, the agriculture, farming, and so forth. Third is family and community, which is in the evening, and that includes agencies, elected leadership, elders, and emotional health. And in the night time is representative of the environment, and that includes plants, vegetation, ecosystems, wildlife, person-land relationship. So this was presented by the medicine men who consulted with us, and that's how we categorized the impacts of the Gold Key mine spill on the Navajo people. So now I will present that to you, which is first spiritual wellness. The people stated that they felt negative impacts to the ceremonial practices, specifically unsafe natural materials and herbs that they use and limited access to the river that they normally have. They also felt uncertain about the future of the Diné culture for their youth, that they're lacking in losing the traditional knowledges. And then moving to economy and livelihood, the people stated in these focus groups that they had negative impacts to the quality of life. They had a disruption and loss and diminishment because of the impact to the river. They also experienced revenue loss and financial hardships. And for example, the consumer not trusting the crops and not buying their crops. They were unsure about the safety of these agricultural food sources, and people began to rely on commercially store-bought food. They also expressed long-term harm to their health, specifically the youth and future generations. Now moving to family and community, the Navajo citizens expressed distrust towards agencies who were involved in the Gold Key mine spill, the water testing that was done. They expressed that the leadership is not present and asked who is advocating on their behalf. They stated that there was poor communication about the spill and the response efforts for both Navajo and non-Navajo agencies. They also stated that they experienced negative impacts to their mental wellness, including having worry, fear, depression, stress, and amplified historical trauma. Now to environment, which is the final stage. They felt negative feelings towards the river, including whether or not it was safe to use, harm to their cultural practices. They were even hesitant to have contact with the river, which we quantified as well. They also had less use and loss of traditional plants and herbs, damaging their relationship with the river and land. They also expressed silence in the environment and distrust of the water quality and testing. So in order to do community-driven research in the Gold Key mine spill project within Navajo Nation, we needed to have bilateral communication. To do bilateral communication, we not only had the 12 focus groups, listening sessions, and teach-ins, we also had CHR training. We had the Navajo Nation president and vice president visit the University of Arizona. We had 3 radio forums. Our project is under the guidance of the Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board. So everything we did was approved by them first. We also engaged in citizen science and community sampling that was led by Diné College and the Farming is Life, where 10 farmers monitored their crops in partnership with Diné College. We also supported testimony that the citizens gave to the New Mexico legislature. And we also held sessions at the Shiprock Act Days for 4 years. So together, along with all of this work, was the importance of healing in the community. And the healing that was ongoing was led by the Diné healer organizations and the medicine people. And in that, when we shared the research findings with the leaders and council delegates and the environmental managers, it all came back to healing. And so they led all of those efforts within the community. So in conclusion, when citizens stated at a teach-in that we can't be biased and place blame, but we have to come together, and it's going to take many generations to fix these issues. We had a lot of support from various federal and state and local and university funding mechanisms to make this partnership possible. Thank you so much, and I'll answer any questions for the dialogue at the end of this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Chief. I'm now pleased to introduce our third speaker, Amber Benally. Amber is a Diné, Hopi, and Zuni woman. She grew up exploring the Colorado Plateau and sought to understand the deep relationship between people and place. Amber graduated from Diné College before earning a bachelor's degree in sociology and environmental studies from Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. Amber's education and family experiences with the toxic history of uranium mining on Navajo land compelled Amber to act on environmental injustices. Amber joined the Grand Canyon Trust in 2018, where she is now the Rising Leaders Manager. Amber believes in the voices of young people, the power of underrepresented populations, and the determination of anyone with a passion. Thanks so much for being here, Amber.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to the Wright-Ingraham Institute for hosting me and allowing me this space to speak. I'm going to start sharing my slides. All right. So again, thank you for having me. Again, my name is Amber Benali. I come from the community of Tuba City, Arizona, currently based out of Flagstaff, Arizona right now, occupied Navajo, Ute, Apache, Hopi, Zuni territories. And I myself identify as a Diné, Hopi and Zuni woman. That is my identity. These are the lands that I come from. And for today, I'm going to talk about the program that I manage here at the Grand Canyon Trust, called the Rising Leaders Program. So first off, a quick introduction about the Grand Canyon Trust itself. The mission of the trust is to safeguard the wonders of the Grand Canyon and the Colorado Plateau while supporting the rights of its native peoples. This iteration of the mission was created in 2018, and I was very happy to be a part of determining what that mission would be, determining what the vision for the Grand Canyon Trust would be. And the vision, I guess, for the trust is to see a place on the Colorado Plateau where, it says it on the slide, but one of the things I like to emphasize is that one of our missions is to make sure sovereign tribal nations thrive. We are a conservation organization, a 501c3 nonprofit, and we work to really target the Colorado Plateau as a whole. And with that, it's a very big space to say that we're trying to protect. As I mentioned, we're located in the very corner of the Colorado Plateau, or in the very bottom of the Colorado Plateau in Flagstaff, Arizona. We have offices remote in Denver, in Durango, in Gallup, New Mexico, and Salt Lake, and a few people spread across Utah. There's 4 big initiatives that the Grand Canyon Trust works on right now, including Native America, energy, land, and water. But as the climate continues to change, so do the initiatives at the Grand Canyon Trust. And with that came the program that I currently manage called the Rising Leaders Program. And so the Rising Leaders Program was born out of the idea that young people need to be involved in the climate justice movement right now. And with that, we created a guiding statement that it is our goal to mobilize hundreds of young people to act on environmental and social justice issues across the Colorado Plateau. And so this is our guiding statement within our own program. And there's a lot of ways that we can mobilize young adults right now. And in my program, we do 3 things. We host professional development opportunities like internships. We make sure our interns are paid above a living wage. We try to call it a thriving wage, where they are fully compensated for their time and for their work. We run field-based service learning trips, where we focus on place-based education across the Colorado Plateau. And then we run advocacy and leadership training programs. And the leadership training program is what I'm going to talk about most today. That is it's a summer program we host every year. And the goal of this program is to equip young people with the skills to enact environmental and social change within their own communities. So briefly, I always like to talk about why do I do this work? Why am I in this work right now? As mentioned before, my undergraduate training is in sociology and environmental studies. And I come from the community of Tuba City, like I mentioned. And I like to reference Tuba City in itself as a refugee community, because Tuba City is labeled as the 2nd largest community on the Navajo Nation. But when you go and you travel through Tuba City, you may wonder, why do people live here? It's a very arid climate. There's not a lot of water. There's really nothing to see here. Why are people here? And the reality of the situation is that people are forced to live there. People have been historically forced to live there because of either impacts by coal mining or impacts by uranium mining. And my family has a history of uranium mining in our family. I have I have grandfathers just 2 generations before me who have been impacted by uranium mining. Tiba City in itself is a downwind community with a uranium processing plant like 10 miles out of it. And so this concept has always been near my life. It's always been something that I've been a part of, that I've seen firsthand. And it wasn't until I got to college that I began to realize that these things aren't normal. You know, it's not normal to heat your house with coal. It's not normal to have to haul your water 70 miles. It's not normal to not have electricity. And so those were the things I realized. And that's why I got into this work. And specifically, I got into the work of working with young people because I think I myself was a frontline youth. I lived in a frontline community. And so I feel like I'm accountable to future generations to do the work that I do right now. And so back to my program and back to the program I was going to talk about. Leadership is the name of the program. It was created in 2019 by a group of young adults, myself included, where we wanted to create a advocacy training program that was based on the Colorado Plateau with the most important issues happening right now. In 2019, we decided to focus on uranium mining, specifically uranium mining around the Grand Canyon, specifically following the haul route that's on this map from the Canyon Mine to the White Mesa Mill. And as you can see, the haul route of the uranium was supposed to travel completely across the Navajo Nation. And when we created Leadership, we wanted to make sure that the voices of these communities were heard by the young people that we recruited to join this program. And so we followed the haul route from Canyon Mine all the way up to the White Mesa Mill. And along the way, we heard the stories of frontline communities, of activists, of grassroots organizers, of scientists. And that was really the crux of beginning this program. And when we talk about place-based education, I think it's super important that young people are hearing the stories that are out there right now, because the histories of this area are so deep-rooted in oral conversation. The histories that my family have are not written in a book, they're oral. And so sharing those pieces with young people, I think, is important. And the demographic we try to seek currently for Leadership is young people who are from the communities who are most impacted by climate change. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the demographic we're getting. Usually we're getting students who are from Flagstaff, students who are non-POC. But at the end of the day, I fully believe that each young person has a role to play when it comes to environmental justice. And so, let's see. This is just a little quick snapshot of the photos and the training, the type of training we do. We really make sure that young people are learning the skills that they need to create change, that they're learning to tell their own stories, and they're learning to change that narrative so that when they go back to their own communities, that they're equipped with the skills that they feel like they can make change. And when designing this program, I want to emphasize that I have myself and another colleague who designed this program, but we continuously take feedback from young people today to make sure that we're teaching the things that they want to learn. At the end of the year, we always ask young people, what is it that you felt you've missed in academia? What do you feel like you wish you had learned if you've already graduated? And those are the things we try to teach. And a lot of the times it ends up being the harder histories, the harder concepts that aren't really shared within institutions. And so, go back. So those are the ways that we've developed Leadership. But within the last 2 years, because of COVID, it's looked a lot different. Taking a place-based educational program that was supposed to happen across the land has looked a lot different for the last 2 years. It's been exactly how we are now in this little gallery view. And we've had to try to figure out, how do we make sure that place-based education is happening through a computer screen? And so that took a lot of creativity on our parts to create curriculum where students were joining us every day, but 3 days out of the week, they were getting out on the landscape safely, socially distanced from each other, and exploring and getting to know the land with themselves. And so that was a journey in itself. I'm excited to be out of this gallery view next year and really back on the landscape with young people, because as you can see on the screen, we've targeted about 40 young people. And the good part about everything happening in the Zoom universe is that we've been able to target young people from across the United States and even young people who live in Canada. So we've had students from California, from Boston, from Illinois, from North Carolina join this project, but each of them have a tie that is specific to the Colorado Plateau, whether they're going to school here, whether they graduated from here, or whether it's their aspirations to move to this area. So that's the demographic we target. And right now, as I mentioned, our focus is going to be more so on students who are from frontline communities, because I want to make sure that they feel like they have a space to learn these skills, that they feel welcomed within the environmental movement. Another reason I got into this work was that when I was at Fort Lewis College, a college that is identified as having one of the highest percentages of Native American students in the United States, when I was in my environmental studies program, there was no one who looked like me. There was no one who looked like me, who was from the communities that I was from. And so the conservation movement in itself has been historically exclusive to white identifying people. And so we really want to make sure that we're creating inclusive spaces for those who are most affected going forward. And so that brings me to our theme for the last 2 years. For the last 2 years, we have focused on this concept of a just transition. And this concept, I think, is just really growing in momentum across the United States, across Indigenous communities. And it was an initiative that was already happening at the Grand Canyon Trust by our Native America program. However, when attending those meetings, I noticed that there was no young people whose voices were included in these conversations that they were having. And so, POC students are already feeling excluded from the conservation and the environmental movement, and you tack on the label of being a young person, they're even more excluded from those conversations. So we decided to focus in on a just transition, and what does that look like specifically? So a just transition in itself is a framework that is really led by the visions of the communities in which they're serving. When we talk about achieving things like energy sovereignty in the Southwest, I want to make sure that young people know that those communities who need electricity should also be at the table when they're talking about solar projects. That when there's any kind of environmental project, that the people who are most affected should be at the table. And historically, it hasn't been that way, right? It hasn't, in this area specifically, it hasn't been that way. And so I want to make sure that young people right now are a part of this just transition process, that their voices are included in these conversations that are developing in this area. And when I get into why young people should be a part of this, I really want to break down the concept of equality versus equity versus justice. And when I talk about these three concepts, sometimes equality and equity, they get used interchangeably. But this graphic is probably the most simple graphic that has informed me that at the end of the day, I want to achieve curriculum that is based with a justice lens. So just briefly looking at the graphic, equality really means giving everyone the same opportunity. Equity means giving people the support they need that is specific to their own needs. But at the end of the day, we're really striving for justice, because with a justice-focused lens, we're getting rid of the barriers that was creating the inequity in the first place. And so that's the framework that we come at leadership with, that we're going to focus on justice, we're going to focus on place-based education, and we're going to focus on young people having power. I think a lot of the times young people can feel disempowered. And a lot of the times young people can feel like they're not, this is just from speaking from my own experience. When I went through academia, I felt like there was a lot of history that I wasn't taught, specific to the area that I came from. And so within leadership, the curriculum we design is a little more real, I guess I would say. We focus in on like colonialism. What is that? What is extractive colonialism? What does it mean to live in a system where capitalism is reigning supreme? What is white supremacy and heteropatriarchy? What are those things, and how do they affect all of us? And so these are just a quick screenshots from a presentation that I give, which really breaks down the history of colonialism, extractive colonialism on the Navajo Nation. And with that, I break down things like, what even is the BIA, and how does that have power over people? How does the government to government relationships disempower people at the end of the day? How has extractive coal mining not benefited the people who live right next to the coal mine? So those are the things that I talk about in leadership, because at the end of the day, those are the things that young people tell me that they want to learn. And so here are a few more example workshops that I teach: anti-oppression and allyship, regenerative economies. What does that look like? Regenerative economies in itself has so many pieces to the puzzle that I think we're all putting together right now. And I just want to make sure that with the Grand Canyon Trust initiatives that are focusing on a regenerative economy right now, that young people feel like they have a voice in that. And then we teach them other things: civic engagement and power, how to be involved politically, because at the end of the day, not everyone's going to want to sign up for a protest. Not everyone's going to want to disrupt institutions. A lot of the time, some people want to go the political route, and that's totally fine. And some people want to go a more radical route, and that's totally fine. Our goal is to put together all of these curriculum and all of these programs that they figure out on their own which path that they want to take at the end of the program. And we hope to inform them that there's a lot of paths within the environmental movement that they have the option to take. And then the next thing we do within leadership is peer-to-peer curriculum. This is my favorite concept out of the whole thing. We want to make sure that power is within the hands of young people. So how do we do that? We set it up so young people are teaching other young people. This whole presentation was put together by a young person this past summer. And I thought it was one of the best workshops that I had gone through within the last 3 years of running this program. And so we want to make sure that young people feel like they're not only the students, but they're also the teachers. And that's how we empower them to continue to share their own voices, to share their own passions. And that's been a real highlight of this program. As I mentioned, the Grand Canyon Trust itself has a goal to ensure that tribal nations thrive. And one way we try to meet that goal is by uplifting the voices, uplifting the voices of Native people and grassroots efforts that have been doing this work for a long time. And that includes organizations like the Hopi Tutsqua Permaculture Institute. I know Lillian Hill spoke with the Wright-Ingraham Institute, I believe. Pueblo Action Alliance, Julia Bernal also spoke here. And Change Labs, Tonajona Ane, Uplift. These are all organizations who have been working towards a just transition for decades. And we're within the Rising Leaders Program and the Grand Canyon Trust, we're like babies, we're barely getting into this work. And these are the people who have been doing this work for a long time. So we want to make sure that young people are exposed to all of these organizations. And it helps create a sense of relatability between young people, especially Native young people, to see that there are people who have put together whole organizations who have been doing this environmental justice fight for a long time. And so it showcases that relatability, that they too can also be involved within this movement. Whew. And so we get into, what does that look like? What is all this accumulating to? And we've hosted 4 leaderships at this point since 2019. And just this past year, we put together a demands list. We had a cohort of about 25 young people who showed up to voice their opinions about what are their 10 demands for the Colorado Plateau for the next 10 years. This was inspired by the 30 by 30 movement by the Biden administration. And together, they are holding not only me and my work accountable to what their demands are, but they're holding themselves accountable to what they want to see for a just future. And so I always tell young people that when you're getting into environmental justice, you're getting in it for the long run. It's a lifelong game where you might not be able to see the fruits of your labor. You might not be able to see when a just world is achieved. But you go into it with the intentionality that one day you're planting the seeds and one day it'll happen. And so breaking that down for young people, I think, sits really well. And so some of the demands on this list, I think, are very impactful. Things like practicing holistic ideologies starting at a young age at home and in school systems. This was really rooted in teaching food sovereignty at an early age. Increasing access and knowledge in a non-exploitative and non-hierarchical manner. What does that mean? That means creating opportunities for young people to share knowledge that's not in a top-down teacher-to-student manner. And another thing is a commitment to healing ourselves, the land, and our waterways. So these are really big goals, and they're really big ambitions. And when it comes to our program, we want to make sure that we're doing the best we can to meet these needs each year. And so those are the ways that I think my program is adding to a just transition right now, because we're really trying to put the power back in young people. We're trying to empower them to share their voices, to share their own narratives, and to have the creative ability to dream up a better future. Because I think we're always taught what a better future would look like. But I think young people are creative, they're urgent, and they're really compassionate with each other. And so I am excited to see how this program will move back to being on the land, because we've made a lot of connections within the last 2 years. I'm excited to take it back on the landscape and meet with all these amazing people who we've met over the last 2 years and see how young people can continuously move towards a just future. That's all I have for you all. Thanks for having me. If you are interested in the Rising Leaders program, you can find it on the Grand Canyon Trust website. You can reach out to me directly. But that's our program. That's what we do. We do a whole lot of other things, but this is what I wanted to focus in on. So thank you.
Thank you so much to our three panelists and speakers. I'm Becky Claussen. I'm a professor of sociology at Fort Lewis College, and I was happy to be asked to help moderate a brief discussion after we've heard from these three great areas to help us think about impacts of extraction. So thank you for what you shared with us this evening. I know the collective has learned a lot, and I just wanted to personally say how much I've learned from the three of you. Dr. Chief, your guidance in leading a multidisciplinary, multi-institutional, culturally anchored research project has just been an incredible learning experience for me, and your thoroughness and always asking how our research can align with a decolonial framework has taught me so much. Amber, your work here at Fort Lewis continues to live on. We use your research, your senior research project as a model of exceptional work here. So you're continuing to teach at this institution. And Jonathan, I always look forward to your work, because I know you get to the root of the problems of current issues. You really look for the historical and social and cultural roots of what we see going around us. And last week we used an article of yours in a class. So I just wanted to acknowledge how much I learned from the three of you. And I know I speak for the collective for this evening as well. So for our moderated discussion, I wanted to focus on the part of this topic, the part of the title of tonight's session called New Directions in Health and Equity. So I wanted to focus on the areas where we see new directions, new potentials, new possibilities. What you've shared with us, the impacts of extraction, in particular Gold King mine spill, has highlighted how environmental issues know no borders. The impacts of acid mine waste cross multiple geopolitical borders of state, federal, tribal jurisdictions. And these borders sometimes split and separate communities from working together. Kim Tallbear, an Indigenous scholar at the University of Alberta, rejects these binaries and hierarchies that were created by settler colonialism to focus instead on what it means for communities to be in good relation. So I thought about that theme for tonight, and I'm wondering if there are examples you've seen in your work of communities within a watershed, within a bioregion, rejecting these artificial borders and coming together to understand environmental health challenges in a way that works together to be in good relation with one another. So it's posed to all three of you, whoever wants to go first, to think about either within this specific work tonight or in a larger context, what ways have you seen communities working together in good relation?
I can chime in here on that question. Thank you, Becky, for that question. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to go to New Zealand, and I had a group of Indigenous water scientists who was interested in how we could work with the grassroots water defenders on topics. And this was around the time that there was a lot of impacts to communities in the plains with the no-DAPL really just inhumane things that occurred with spraying of, toxic chemicals on people and just unheard things happening. So we wanted to work with grassroots organizers on how we as scientists could help in this topic. So this was a ongoing activity that we're trying to work on, and so we wanted to learn from other communities. So we went to New Zealand and attended a STEM day that was actually headed by Dr. Tallbear. So Dr. Tallbear has a science center where she does this type of work. And so it was part of a larger conference on Indigenous studies. So we attended, and we got to learn about all these different Indigenous scientists in New Zealand working with their communities on environmental challenges. And one of the ones I recall, there were so many that were presented, like just anything from like drones and capturing aerial footage for the purposes of the community. But one thing that came up that really hit me was their work on water quality data. So all the communities work together to collect water quality, water quantity data on the river, and had a online access to their water data that was only available to them. And then they use that information to fight for their water rights, including personhood designation for the river. And then eventually they got personhood where they had a cultural knowledge holder be the representative of the river, as well as like another policy representative for the river. So I think that was a good example of their communities coming together to collectively identify their priorities, but also to collect data and create a database of this water quantity and quality that eventually helped to get the designation. They're actually going to be doing a forum on November 19th called Sacred Gatherings. I think it's called, but I'll put it in the chat. And so they're trying to reach out to Native nations in the United States to learn, to have a cross-cultural learning. So yeah, so I thought that was interesting, and I learned a lot from the New Zealand in terms of their data sovereignty and community-driven work and for their rivers.
Thank you for bringing in the international scope of it all too, so we can deconstruct borders globally as well. Jonathan, Amber, did you have any comments to that question?
I mean, I guess one thing that strikes me, or that occurs to me as far as breaking down barriers to get something done is definitely the effort to get the Bears Ears National Monument designated. Because here you had 5 different tribal nations, sovereign tribal nations coming together, some of whom didn't always have great relations in the past, but they came together for a single goal. And they basically said, you know, this isn't about state lines or county lines and all that kind of stuff. This is about homelands and about protection of cultural resources and our common cultural resources. And so I thought that was one example of definitely where those artificial barriers are broken down to accomplish a goal that was pretty much accomplished in the end. So yeah, that's one.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great example of how that can persist too, as the political winds changed and it seemed like, things were being overturned, like how that unity and that strength of working together can persist and hopefully now have the needed protection. Amber, that's probably part of your campaign as well. At Grand Canyon Trust.
Yeah, when it comes to borders, I think Bears Ears was a really good like showcase of working across borders, intertribal work. That's a part of the trust that I don't work in, but one that I do work in with the Just Transition conversations that we've been having over the last couple months is really focused right now on Navajo and Hopi communities. So they've been most impacted by coal mining. And so really trying to get those two communities to come together to share with us what they would like to see, especially what they would like to see for their own economies. And I think in itself, the organization Change Labs does a really good way of making sure that every Native voice is at the table for dreaming up new economies.
Thank you. I wanted to switch the focus here for new directions of how we do the work that we do. So I think it's just wonderful that this panel is a scientist, a journalist, a community organizer, activist. And I wonder if the three of you could share a bit about a new direction of how we're trying to reframe the work we're doing to avoid the what's sometimes thought of as research fatigue, communities that have had over research, if you will, the difficulty in working in places where research has been harmful in the past to communities. We're also seeing the much needed turn away from a deficit model of research where we're continually looking at problems and hardships and struggle. And so I think there's a turn happening there in how we do the work that we're doing. And so I was curious to ask the three of you if you see best practices in your fields for addressing some of those concerns coming from the communities of research fatigue, or kind of how do we shift away from a deficit model into an empowered model?
I can start the conversation. So I think in my line of work, I always see, unfortunately, frequent researchers that come in wanting to do work, but have never visited the community, never talked to the people, and yet they want to include the community in their proposal, which is due tomorrow. So that's just not gonna work. And what I try to teach my colleagues is that they need to be doing service. They need to be learning, listening, and training themselves and their students in how to ethically and responsibly work with Indigenous communities, and to think about how their research will benefit the community and also elevate the Native American students. Like Amber was saying, a lot of us go through our school without ever meeting another Indigenous student or another Indigenous faculty who's doing that's in their work. And then also supporting students to do work and research and training that involves their community. I went through my whole education, I'm from Black Mesa, and my whole reason for even going to college was because my family's been impacted by coal mining, and I wanted to go to school to try to find a way to help my family, my community. And all the way through my entire schooling, it wasn't considered cutting edge research. Nobody supported me to do that type of work. And I want to change that that culture in academia to to basically raise that issue with my colleagues, to say that if a student wants to do work with their community, they should, and you should support them. And if you're not going to support them, find another faculty who will do that. So when faculty want to work with communities, there's a lot of elements that they need to do on their end prior to even trying to incorporate or try to suddenly put a tribal community into their proposal. So that's a whole training that needs to be done and culture change that needs to be done in academia that Amber raised so eloquently here that I'm trying to do in my work to show an example. And so I think there's a lot of fatigue in the sense that communities are constantly giving, but yet the work is not directly rejuvenating their own community or upholding what they need or what their priorities are. So that's where community-driven research is really a big passion of mine, where I want to be invited. I want the community to drive that research and then find ways to sustain that beyond just a grant, a 3-year grant. How can we make these stepping stones all connect to make it sustainable in the long term?
Thank you. I appreciate that crossover between the service work and the mentoring that you do to students as well, and that way that you have your foot in both the academic and the community-based work is a great model. Jonathan or Amber, would you like to add to that?
I can pick up a little bit. There's one thing I always say at the trust. The Grand Canyon Trust is really focused on protecting the public lands of the Colorado Plateau. And I tell them, if you want young people to protect our public lands, you need to make sure that we're increasing the accessibility that young people have to our public lands, because it takes a lot of money to recreate, and so if we want them, and it's kind of the same idea when it comes to research. If we want young people, at the end of the day, we need more Native scientists. We need more Native researchers who come from these communities, because that's the only way I think we're going to see real change. And I want to make sure that science in itself is accessible to Native youth, because our ancestors have lived on this land since time immemorial, and they've historically been scientists, and they've known how to work this land for so long, and it's rooted in us. But, this history of colonization has kind of detached us from that understanding. And so I want to make sure that when it comes to research, that we're working within reciprocity of setting up young people for success. And that looks a lot of different ways. And I think it takes a really structured strategy to get young people, young Native youth, young POC youth into the STEM fields.
Sounds like your field school is a great way to get that access piece. I'm excited you'll get to have in person this summer. Jonathan, what do you think the role of media and journalism can be to provide these new directions for community?
Yeah, actually, I think it's similar to both of what Amber and Dr. Chief said. As far as one, try to avoid helicopter journalism, where, as they call it, where somebody drops into a community and tries to cover it in 2 days and then leaves. It's better as an editor, as a publication, if you want a story about a certain place, it's, really try to find somebody, a journalist from that place, to cover it first. And if you can't, then that's one thing. But if you can, I think it's important. And then also, something that's, I think, difficult for journalists to do, but that's to focus also on not only the problems, but also solutions. It's called solutions journalism, but really looking at what people, especially grassroots groups, are doing to fix this situation or to improve the situation that they're in, and really focus on that rather than all of the bad stuff that's happening, even though, it's certainly important to highlight that bad stuff, but also to really to show what the community is doing to help itself. And so I think really important.
I thank you to the three of you for building on the presentations, and you're really models in each of your respective fields for showing us the new directions. So I will turn it back over to the Wright-Ingraham folks if you have any closing remarks, and thank you again for all being a part of this.
No, just thank you so much to the four of you. Thank you, Dr. Chief. Thank you, Dr. Claussen. Thank you, Amber and Jonathan, for being here tonight and sharing with us. And I want to thank everyone at the Wright-Ingraham Institute who made this speaker series possible. This is our last event for the year, and I think it was a great one to end on. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Ariel. Well done. Thank you all. Really nice to meet you all. Becky, good to see you again. Carletta, thank you. Jonathan, Amber, thank you all. It was a great evening. Thanks so much.